Hello, my dear English-speaking friends in Hong Kong and elsewhere, especially Filipinos working hard to earn a living and serving people who really need your help. We are all living in an era of suffering, whether physical or spiritual. I would like to share with you the meaning of suffering written by His Holiness St.John Paul II. The Holy Father had experienced all sorts of suffering from childhood till the end of his earthly life. He has all the rights to share with us this topic, the meaning of suffering. Whether in this Lent season or outside this season, I think it is an excellent topic for our spiritual growth. So I hope the sharing will strengthen you and me in difficult times, bring us comfort and hope throughout our journey to a better future. The meaning of suffering is divided into 6 sections, namely, first, to live is to suffer. Second, God expects us to ask why. Third, getting to know Job. Fourth, God wills salvation, not suffering. Fifth, Jesus gives pain purpose. And lastly, suffering calls forth love. To live is to suffer. Remember our human story. Back through the books of history, we see suffering all over its pages. Sickness and war, hatred and oppression, poverty and death, all have been among us from the start of human life. As Christians, we read from the Bible how our first parents, Adam and Eve, encountered suffering for the first time, the guilt of sin, and the agony of death. There is the Garden of Eden. Suffering makes its entrance onto the stage of humanity. But that was just the start. Suffering continued to show its ugly face in many other forms to the men and women of the Old Testament. Abel's murder by his resentful brother, Cain. The jealous betrayal of Joseph by his older brothers. Israel's toil and oppression in Egypt. Job's agonizing quest to make sense of his torments, etc. We also see an abundance of suffering in the New Testament. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that horrific suffering accompanied the joyous birth of the Messiah, the one who would save God's people. Upon learning of the ancient prophecy that a new king of the Jews, that is Jesus, was to be born, King Herod plotted to have the newborn Messiah killed. He ordered to kill all the boys in Bethlehem in an effort to protect his throne. The New Testament describes Jesus' public ministry, in which our Lord found himself immersed in a community of sufferers who heard and looked to him for healing, like the blind man Bartimaeus, who lived in darkness, the centurion who mourned his servant's terminal illness, and the woman ravaged by hemorrhages. Such accounts inform us that Jesus dedicated a large part of his life to comforting those around him who were in pain. He felt especially drawn to the sufferers of his time and worked to bring them spiritual and physical healing. The Bible reminds us of Jesus' life. We see that he shed tears at the death of his friend Lazarus and fought temptation during his 40 days in the desert. In Jesus' final days, the Passion narratives tell us how he felt the heartbreak of being betrayed by a good friend, the humiliation of public persecution, and excruciating pain of being tortured to death, a cup from which the apostles would also drink as the consequence of their faith. Today, thousands of years after, suffering still plagues our story. The modern networks, internet, or newspaper, TV, explain in detail how suffering blankets our planet. Widespread starvation, genocide, war, terrorism, abortion, poverty, murder, and the other evils taking the world by storm. In the words of John Paul, suffering seems to be and is almost inseparable from man's earthly existence. Perhaps this is the most formidable challenge of living, contending with the truth that suffering is and will be a part of our story. Sinful roots. According to the book of Genesis, Satan and human sin are to blame for the sad fact of suffering. Chapter 3 describes a disruption in creation when Adam and Eve abused their freedom by giving in to the serpent to rebel against God. Reading through the creation story, we see that suffering was not part of God's original blueprint for the world. Pain and death came to exist not by God's will, but through the tangled maze of human sin. Original sin has a twofold meaning. First, original sin refers to a historical event described in Genesis, that first personal act of human disobedience which offended God, subjected creation to suffering, introduced sin and death into the world. Second, by original sin also points to a spiritual disorder of our human nature, the condition of weakness within us that blinds us to truth and attracts us to evil over good. In John Paul's word, the mystery of pain tortures our existence. It is not easy to accept pain and death, because it means accepting our frailty in its many forms. We long to be free from the evil that surrounds us. In our moments of trial, we realize our need to be saved. The good news of the gospel is that Jesus Christ has already come, offering salvation to all. The new Adam, Jesus, through faithful obedience to God, reversed the harmful effects of Adam's sin. But if Jesus righted Adam's wrongs that brought suffering into the world, why do we still have to suffer? Jesus himself informed his disciples that the earth would not break free from cycles of suffering until he comes again in glory. Sin and death, he predicted, would continue in this world until his return to establish God's everlasting reign at the end of time. Experiencing evil. According to John Paul, suffering is an experience of evil. But what is evil? This question, says the Pope, seems in a certain sense inseparable from the theme of suffering. Evil is the absence of good. The presence of evil in the world is like the holes in a piece of sweet cheese. It is a negative reality that takes away from the good and whole order of God's creation. Evil is present in the gaps where these goods are absent. So suffering is experienced evil that deprives us of the good we have meant to have as human persons. For example, why I have to wear glasses? Because something missing from my good eyes. Bodily suffering takes many shapes, like broken bones, stuffy noses, headaches, heart disease, cancer, labor pains, indigestion, and countless other distresses. John Paul reminds us that human suffering is even wider and more complex than physical illness or pain. We also experience spiritual or moral suffering, which the Pope calls pain of the soul. Spiritual suffering involves struggle of the soul, such as guilt from sin, dryness in prayer, or feeling distant from God. Spiritual suffering also includes forms of psychological and emotional distress such as disappointment, frustration, depression, anxiety, sadness, etc. Spiritual suffering, not like bodily suffering, tends to be more difficult to put under the microscope. It's often felt, but not seen. We do know what it is like to struggle with prayer. Our encounters with evil not only wound our bodies, but also pain our souls. Indeed, suffering penetrates us to the core. Suffering is the way we experience evil, which saps the good God created us to have as human persons. Knowing our limitation. As John Paul has pointed out, some of our trials result from the exercise of human freedom, when we or others make bad decisions and mistakes. They included persecution, war, crime, and poverty, demonstrate types of suffering for which human beings stand personally or collectively responsible. Such large-scale evils find their roots in human soil, fertilized by hatred, anger, revenge, greed, ignorance, ambition, and confusion. The suffering we have just happened to us looks blurry. We cannot always be sure what or who brings suffering into our lives. Suffering teaches us the unsettling truth that we don't have total control over things. We don't want to suffer, but the reality which confirms that as beings who are made by nature created, we don't get to choose the essential conditions of the world into which we're born. And yet, suffering continues because it is the human condition. So the challenge of coping with the many limitations suffering imposes on us becomes ours by virtue of our existence. A sinful world. According to John Paul, we can think of suffering as its own world that coexists within our own. He writes, human suffering constitutes a specific world which exists together with man. If you were to piece together the hurt felt by every human being, it would form a world of suffering. So, a small part of this world exists within each one of us in such a way that it sometimes appears in us and then moves on, while in other instances it becomes deeply rooted in us and abides for a longer period of time. In these and many other instances of suffering, the Pope explains that our first response is, I am affected by, I experience a feeling, I suffer. Then we begin to ask, why me? Or how can I bear this? We may even, is my life worth living? But we can find support and help from others. No one else can bear the suffering that belongs to us. As a result, we are able to find comfort in the company of others who have walked in our shoes and know what we are going through, although we ultimately must endure our suffering alone. John Paul writes that the world of suffering has grown especially large in our present history. According to the Pope, today we live in a special world of suffering that is particularly severe because of the massive amount of pain we as a collective people have brought on ourselves. And yet, if we live rationally, enlightened by faith, we realize that many wounds we incur are caused by the forces of evil that inhabit the condition of our existence. Indeed, as John Paul has taught us, to live is to suffer. A reality that each one of us must face. This is the end of the first section.